Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is Sal Salamone. He's the managing editor of Network Computing. I'm sure many listeners are already familiar with their work, and I certainly recommend staying up with the excellent coverage they have of our industry. Our topic was one mostly new to me, all about the emerging market for direct-to-device satellite communications. We start out, as we often do in the show, by defining the market, and then get into some current specific use cases and what's likely to develop in that space in the near future, as well as what has been driving the general renewed interest in satellite communications across the telecom industry. Then we get into what this emerging market means for carriers more specifically, and how we're in the beginning stages of standards and regulations within this new industry, and the creation of new industry bodies and even a new FCC bureau that's focused on space communications. I always enjoy hearing about a market that had not really hit my radar yet, and I hope you will as well. Welcome to the show, Sal.
Hello, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I've been wanting to do this for a while because we talked last year at the MEF G&E conference. I got kind of busy with other things on the podcast this year, and so I'm glad we've finally gotten together. And I'm really excited about this topic because it's one I haven't hit on the show directly before, so that's always fun. But before we do that, Sal, could you just give us a brief background on yourself, and then, of course, what you do as the managing editor of Network Computing?
Sure. So I started out as a physicist, and that's how I got my interest in communications. We did our very experiments with radar equipment and needed to move a lot of data between 4 sites across the globe. And this was pre-internet days, pre-high-speed cable days. So just got very interested in different communication systems, and ended up making that a career, writing about them. And
Cool.
so that's how I got into it. And just to give you an idea of the time frame, the types of things I was looking at for very low speed, like there were media burst communication systems where you bounce signals off of these microscopic meteors that are always entering the atmosphere and burning up and making an ionized trail. So very exotic stuff. And now it's you just hit send and it goes from Massachusetts to Puerto Rico or wherever the labs are, and you're done. But so that's how I get into it, and been writing for a long time. All aspects. Worked for a fiber optics magazine. Worked on very early day a fiber to the home magazine. Lots of things involving wireless technologies. And now at Network Computing, as you mentioned, I'm the managing editor. We focus on a lot of topics, network management issues, network security. My area is still on the communication side, on the backbone networks. And what's going on there is great. A lot of interesting things like MEF with their NAS, network as a service. These services like SASE that combine networking with security with connectivity and offer it in a cloud-based way. So a lot going on right now. And I think one of the big themes we're seeing is, a need for connectivity, but not just a need for it, but how I think, in the old days, everyone looked for high availability. And one of our best performing articles this year, the headline was something along the lines of, forget high availability. Enterprises need always on services now. So that's it. It was a lot, that we're looking at. And, I'm in that area about the backbone networks. And I think that's one of the things how I've gotten in touch with you with some of the with subsea cables and other things like that. So
Yeah, I was going to say that dovetails well with telegeography, the podcast in general. I do talk further up the stack a little bit more than my colleagues, actually, because I have to cover things like SD-WAN and SASE and things like that. But principally we're focused on layers 1, 2, and 3. You're mostly layer 1 even. So I think that's the key that we think about and how we envision the world. And I guess layer 1, more or less, is what we're talking about today, but specifically over spectrum. So I've talked about satellites a fair bit on the show, and I've, of course, talked about wireless, especially as an enterprise technology on the show. But I haven't really talked ever about where the two intersect. So that's what we're focusing on today, the sort of direct to device kit. But of course, this is a nascent sort of thing in the marketplace, and our goal on the show is always to not lose anyone, to keep everybody up with us and explain the internet, as it were. So let's just start out very basically with a definition of what direct to device satellite services are.
Yeah, so I think it melds a couple of things that have been going on both in the consumer and the enterprise spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for years there was talk of machine to machine communications, and it kind of plays off of that. But uh, we're seeing it on the consumer side, direct to device. It's things like now almost all the smartphone manufacturers are offering satellite messaging
Mm-hmm.
in some in emergency situations, some is with a fee. And then in the enterprise space, it's more, you know, connecting something in the field that
Mm-hmm.
in the past uh, perhaps would have been connected with wireless first, then, connect that indeed like a wireless access point and that connected to the internet. But here it's direct satellite to the device in the field. So
Mm-hmm. So we're talking both devices like we might normally as consumers think of them, smartphones, handsets, that sort of thing, but also all manner of IoT devices that might be out
yeah,
there for all different
yeah,
kind of purposes. Gotcha. Okay. So, you know, obviously the consumer side is always interesting, and that's where a lot of these things start. And I'm always saying some of the same things over and over again in the show, but there's a lot of technologies that work their way into the enterprise side that really
yes.
born as consumer technologies, and they have to be, sort of made into enterprise ready technologies. But if we focus on the enterprise side, what's really driving demand for this? I mean, you just mentioned, remote sites, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What are enterprises looking to do that they can't currently do?
Sure. So it's, you know, basically there's a need for global connectivity in a lot of
Hmm.
industries. And that's everything from like collecting telemetry from fleets of
Hmm.
trucks across the globe, to do logistics and planning, to the gathering data about equipment health status, whether it's a wind turbine in the middle of the North Sea or
Right.
uh, a device in a factory that perhaps you want to connect it globally together. So there's that global connectivity need. That's one, and then the other is the explosion, as you mentioned, the explosion in IoT devices and the need to access the data they produce.
Right.
So I saw one estimate just recently. There's it came out in June that there's a 100 million IoT devices deployed in industrial verticals like
Okay.
utilities, manufacturing, waste management. So they're out there.
Hmm. It's going to outnumber employees and users someday, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and
No,
then
that's really interesting. That when we hear these buzzwords all the time, digital transformation, right? Digital transformation has been going on for a long time, but for the carrier, for most people listening to this
yeah,
show, or in the telecom business, or sort of adjacent to it because they're managing large networks or whatever, what digital transformation really means is the need for connectivity everywhere all the time, right? You know what I mean?
yeah.
That's what it all comes down to. Yeah. So yeah.
And I think the other thing that's on the enterprise side that's making this more practical is that there's lower cost and more services available.
Hmm.
Just because it's significantly less expensive to deploy satellites now.
Right. Right.
With all the all of the services that have emerged. So one of this, when we just taking a look before we get on, I think there's over 70 companies right now that offer satellite IoT or direct-to-device services. Now some of them are very small, but
Hmm.
that just gives it a bit of a perspective that I think 5 years ago this was not. We were nowhere near that many. So the lower
Yeah.
cost has made it much more easier to get satellite services.
No, that's fascinating, and I think, like you mentioned, I looked at this list when we were talking about this ahead of time, and you sent me some material. There's definitely a long tail to it. Some like really small, kind of like with SD WAN. There's like
Yeah,
four or
yeah,
five providers that most multinationals would use, but then there's like 20 more that fill particular niches. And I always use the analogy of the jar of marbles, but then you can dump the sand in, and you know what I mean, that sort of thing. But I was still really surprised by that number, because if you had asked me previously, I could have named three or
yeah.
four satellite companies at all, right? So
and
yeah,
and not
yeah, that's
and not to dwell too much on it, but
mhm.
one of the things that's happening is like one of the things we've been writing a bit about the uh, decommissioning of 3G
Mm-hmm.
services, so that these carriers want to use that spectrum for other things
Right.
and move you up, get to
Hmm.
LTE and 4G and that's and 5G. But it turns out there's areas of the world where they don't have those other things. So
Right.
Bob Wallace, one
Right.
of our writers, just he did an article earlier this year about in some regions they've had to revert back to 2G devices to communicate
Absolutely.
because
Yeah.
so
Wow.
anyway, so it's so these services are popping up to fill this need, so for
Hmm.
connectivity.
No, that no, I find that actually really interesting, for several reasons, but that especially going back to 2G, and that that's not crazy when you think about what satellite, the kinds of bandwidth the satellite can offer. You mentioned before that on the consumer side, what you're talking about is like
Yeah,
emergency texting and things. We're not
yeah.
talking about like LTE or even 5G data flow
Or
levels or
streaming
anything like
a
that.
movie or something. Yeah,
Right.
via
Right.
yeah.
And that's the thing about IoT, right? Is that IoT is very often incredibly low bandwidth. It's just that it has to be always on, and it has to be
Yeah,
anywhere the device is, right? So
yeah,
yeah. So I think this fills a niche that I knew was there, but didn't know that we were sort of getting ready to fill. And then the last thing, Sal, I'll say before we move on to the sort of next section here is just thinking about the economics, because you touched on that quickly, but as everybody probably listening to the show knows, it's really expensive to dig trenches, to build towers, to lay enough fiber to those towers, and that sort of thing. And there are diminishing returns to doing that the further you are from a certain number of users,
yeah,
obviously, right? So satellite, we never covered at telegeography for years and years and years, because as expensive as that is, it paled in comparison to launching things into space, right? So
yes,
I think there's a fundamental non-telecoms thing going on. You have a physics background, right? So it's all about changing the economics of the physics of sending things to space, basically, right?
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
and when you talk about that cost, and this has always been an issue with any communication technology. And I mentioned I had written for a fiber to the home
Hmm.
publication, and this was in the late 1980s where it was just starting,
Oh wow, yeah.
and they couldn't cost justify it. There was we didn't
Hmm.
have internet and video streaming. There was no application for it,
Right.
and the only way they could these regional bells could justify projects or the competitive local exchange carriers was to go into very rich communities. So we
Mm.
actually called it fiber to the rich
Hmm.
instead of
Hmm.
fiber to the home. And
Yeah.
even with that, as we can tell this day and age, we're still waiting for for most of the world's waiting for fiber to the home because of the cost of that last connection point. So
Yeah, well, and orthogonal to our conversation kind of here, but it brings up a good point in the sense of like, the fiber to the premises kind of builds that did
Yes.
get done were once you could
Right.
monetize it with television and things like that as
Right.
well, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think there's always that need to match up the technology and your ability with what the customers, even enterprises, are demanding, right? And what they can do with it, right?
And I think that ties right into what we going to talk about next.
Hmm.
When you look at the carrier side of this, how can they? One of the reasons that the carriers are looking at satellite is because there's been a bigger change in the industry, or there is one going on where the traditional telcos are having their lunch eaten by the cloud service providers, with
Yeah.
delivering these beyond connectivity services. So there's this uh, transition happening where the phrase that people are using are techcos. Telcos are
Mm.
morphing into techcos,
Hmm.
which is where they are trying to deliver more of these sort of IP, advanced IP services like, security or premium connectivity services. So that's sort of like the high, something that's happening in general that sort of ties in with this, the satellite part fits
Right.
right in with that trend.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this is an age old thing in the carrier market, that there's a natural tendency towards commoditization of communications technologies, right? And the ever need to sort of put something on top of that differentiates you, and that sort of thing. But it's also a real issue in the enterprise network, which is something that I talk about all the time,
Right.
right? So that transition away from the sort of straightforward MPLS network connecting offices to the on-premises data centers, now this incredible complexity, not just in terms of the where the network is connecting to, but all of the multiplication of devices and things that need to be on the network and all of that. That there really is something to that sort of telco to techco. I think it's also not a pure buzzword, but describes a real problem that needs to be solved. Absolutely, yeah. So what else has been driving kind of this market from the carrier side?
Yeah. So there's the one of the things was, there was a lack of interest, or it was hard to work with satellite providers before because they
Mm-hmm.
often used a lot of proprietary technology.
Right.
So, things like their ground stations really didn't connect up to anything else. So there's been a modernization going on,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with satellite ground systems. And many of the uh, operators are uh, sort of updating their proprietary systems to more standards based and quite often IP technologies, so
Right.
that now they can play well with the telcos and the carrier, the others that are going to be leveraging these services. So
Now
that's
that
one thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point too, because again, if we look at the history of telecoms, right, that's the step that's always necessary for things to really become useful, right? Because it's so often that you have engineers in a lab somewhere designing something, and it's only when that becomes fully interoperable across the globe or whatever, it does the network effect take over, and it becomes truly a market like product, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And then, there's other things going on because of the interest uh, within the satellite community, satellite services community. There's been a lot of things happening. So one is earlier this year, a group formed called the Mobile Satellite Services Association,
All
and
right.
it was like an association whose goal was they aimed to accelerate the emergence of direct-to-device services,
Right.
and they're playing in all markets, so it'd be for both businesses and consumers.
Hmm.
Right now, it's more just a high level. They've been adding members and defining things they want to do. But it's anytime these sort of industry organizations form, the whole goal is to get some sort of a common base about how these things should work, so that it's not 15 or 70 different versions
Hmm.
of a
Hmm.
service. So that's one. There's a lot going on the standard side. For a long time, there's been the 3GPP standard, which I think it's third generation partnership project,
Okay.
and it's kind of like an umbrella organization of it includes many standards organizations that develop protocols for mobile communications.
Hmm.
So now that's playing into the satellite space. So they're sort of starting to play in that field. And one point I think to me is very interesting. The FCC just formed a new space bureau that's focused on policy and licensing matters related to satellites and space-based communication. So everyone's getting in on this right now. So
Yeah, well, that's really important. So to circle back on your first point, it's just
okay,
that
yeah,
yeah, just that these I think sometimes people can be cynical about the organizations. Oh, that's another thing I have to. But again, I see it historically as crucial to the development
yes,
of network technologies, because you have to get this whole co-opetition model and everything only works when everyone is on the same page. And we've really seen certain markets, even in recent years, only take off once those sorts of standards, or even just if it's not explicit standards, just the cooperation about how we're going to approach this market or whatever
yeah,
for that to work, because the world's a big place and
yeah,
there's always lots of companies involved in that. But and then secondly, I'll say I was unaware that the FCC had started this new bureau, and again,
yeah,
until you sent me this information, which is really interesting. I want to sort of maybe pick your brain on that a little bit, on in terms of what it is that the FCC, like, what they're hoping to do here. Is it mainly spectrum oriented, or are there other issues?
yeah. I think a lot of the focus is on spectrum
Hmm.
issues, and and that ties back to what the MSSA is doing too. With them, they they're the, so the MSSA, the Mobile Satellite Service Association, is working with organizations like the 3GPP,
Hmm.
and I think they want to integrate the terrestrial and non-terrestrial networks.
Right.
That's sort
Right.
of their thing. Where I think with the FCC, I think most of it is to align, the resources you need to be able to start offering satellite communication systems. So basically, broadening the use of low Earth orbiting satellites in the spectrum, so that we can then have more availability. I think it's very early what they're doing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we'll be following that. I know, as I mentioned, Bob Wallace, one of our feature writers, he's been covering the telecom market for many years, so he's been following this for us. And they I think the big thing from their perspective is to speed up the regulatory reviews that are
Right.
required. So that's what I think. So that's, I think, is the main gist right now.
Yeah, well, in one of the reasons I ask is I actually recently did a whole episode with an attorney all about telecommunication law, and one of the things that we were sort of thinking through there is just how, for better or worse, sometimes the FCC leads other regulatory agencies, right, and they start
Right.
taking their cue from that, right, and the issue of how best to manage things like spectrum, like the idea that spectrum is not all the same quality, and there are issues with bleeding across the edges, right? It's to give a real estate analogy to it, it's like there's downtown property, and there's rural property and industrial property, and the borders between those can get fuzzy and interfering. So certainly it's good to see that a regulator is thinking about, okay, well, there's suddenly going to be a huge sort of use case for a spectrum that wasn't there before, and we need to think through this, because it
Yeah.
is a limited resource, which I think especially people outside the industry maybe even some inside that are focused mainly on wireline tend to forget, right, that spectrum is a limited resource that has to be sort of carefully managed, right? So,
Yeah,
and
very much so.
can be a limiting factor to how useful something like this technology might
Right.
be ultimately for enterprises.
Right. Definitely.
Cool. So what do you see happening in the near term? So we are very nascent here, I should say, obviously from what we've been talking about. But what do you see as the next big steps to kind of watch out for in terms of the development of this direct to device market?
Yeah, I think we'll see individual providers offering services here and there. This year, already one satellite provider is teaming with a traditional carrier Ethernet company,
Mm,
and
hmm
they're
hmm
offering carrier Ethernet via satellite connectivity to satellite. So I think we'll start seeing these types of not one-off things, but general things. A lot aimed at the IoT space, where the
Right.
bandwidth, it's just uh, very small amount of data, but
Right.
needs to be sent constantly, and so that services in those areas, I think we'll start seeing, and
hmm
I think just many more people, many more players entering the market. So
Right.
when that happens, always prices go down.
Yep. Yep.
So I have not looked in great detail at the pricing for these because the services aren't that
hmm
plentiful right now.
hmm
But I think we're seeing things in the consumer space. With you know SpaceX,
Starlink and yeah.
home,
hmm
home, broadband.
Yeah.
You know, uh, these things weren't available, 3 years ago, 4 years
Right.
ago, even. And they're now not ubiquitous, but people get used to it. They It's an alternative.
hmm
We're getting used to different connectivity. Many people are switching to fixed wireless access
Right.
versus broadband for some enterprise location. So I think the same thing will happen in the satellite space with the direct to device services that
hmm
we'll start seeing one off here and there, and we hope to we'll hopefully cover them, not every service, but we'll
Yeah.
look at some of the major trends in network computing as we go along. So
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I mean, obviously, everybody knows that it comes down to price, right? And as I said before, that's what's held satellite back in the past.
yeah,
The when you look at the things from a wireline perspective at the sort of
yeah,
price per bit level,
right,
right? That the
yeah,
throughputs were very low. Now the Leo kind of now we're talking just internet access like Starlink. The Leo satellites that are out there have a much better price per bit in that sense. But I think also get your take on this that from the enterprise perspective, well, consumer wise, principally, I take it what we're looking at here is like, oh, I've gone hiking and I need to send a text, right? You know what I mean? It's
yeah,
it's for remote sites, but or even on the enterprise, agricultural company, like you said, trucking company, something like that needs truly ubiquitous global coverage. But I wonder if you think there's also a use case, even in denser, more well-served areas, when there's just some wireline limitation, right? So a
yeah,
lot of enterprises these days, especially those that are running SD-WAN and whatnot, need secondary, tertiary links. Sometimes that's hard to get. 5G developments are still limited to particular areas in a lot of countries, and then if you only have one wireline provider, I would think that there might be a use case for this even in a multi-tenant office building somewhere that just only has one wireline provider, for example.
yeah. I agree, and I think it is that the second or third
hmm
option.
Right, not your
When you,
primary connectivity
yeah,
necessarily,
well, you
right?
still need this connectivity one way or the other, and
Right.
or so, and it will also, as you mentioned, be price sensitive. So if all of a sudden your connectivity rate fees are going up astronomically as they are in some places, maybe those expensive satellite services will, in comparison,
Yeah.
as they're, come down, be more, competitive. But yeah, I think it's just, it is in some places it might be the primary,
Hmm.
remote areas, but in dense areas anywhere, it could be easily the second or third, back, choice
Yeah.
when you do need the connectivity, and especially as it go back to what, I said at the start, it's forget high availability. If people want now always on.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
in the past you might be able to say, well, okay, so this link is down. We'll collect the data once the link's
Right.
established from that device. But now the world's operating in real time, and
Hmm.
uh, decisions are being made. Think logistics, many industries.
Yeah.
When that data stops coming in, it makes those real time decisions. They're not being carried out the way they should be. So it could
Yeah.
lead to errors. So
And that's if you built your digital transformation model on that connectivity, then all of a sudden
yeah,
you're losing millions of dollars every minute you're down. Exactly.
yeah.
And like I said before, with SD-WAN, you have the ability to integrate these different underlay technologies and have failovers without an
Yes.
engineer even knowing necessarily until after the fact that it's happened. But the key is that you don't get a call at 2 a.m. that the
Yes.
telemetry device is down or whatever. Right. So that's what all the network managers are really looking for, right? Is to not get calls at
Yes.
2 a.m.
Yes.
Anything to help that. Excellent. Well, yeah, this has been really fascinating. Thank you for bringing it to my attention and our listeners as well. I'm sure it should be obvious to anybody listening to this how to find you, but do you want to tell us, where to go for network computing?
Yeah. So networkcomputing.com. I'm pretty much right every week. We have a good group of longtime contributors. The
Hmm.
publication goes back 30 or so years.
Yeah.
So we have some people, seasoned, industry writers that really know the markets here, and have a good way to digest it and present it in an easy way. To We keep on top of the trends, and we post several times a day. So just check out the site, and you can see what we're up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of a shameless plug for me. I read it because that's my area, right? So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge. I did not know that your background was physics. So next time I catch up with you, I'll have to sort of pick. I love science, but I have a more social science background. But pick your brain on exactly how spectrum works and the Shannon limit and
Okay.
things like that. That I always know I should understand better than I do. So, yeah.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.